Socrates and the Bible. Are the two compatible? The question doesn't pertain to philosophy simpliciter and the Bible. The question pertains to Socratism and the Bible. Medieval theologians swore by a fundamental compatibility between the two. So let us consider in what way, in what sense, Socrates and the Bible are compatible. The Socratic life, this is what we're talking about, and the teachings of the Bible. Are they compatible or not? Well, let us begin by considering philosophy prior to Socrates, or any lesson that is kindred to the Socratic one. And we see that philosophy is a term that is quite broad and that can apply, in fact, to any quest for truth. And the quest is usually understood as an ascent. So the ascent is, of course, arduous, and it is only the heroes who dare ascend to truth. So not many people will bother. So classical literature is filled with examples of heroes who seek the truth. Oedipus is one example, one obviously notorious example. We have, in general, tragic poetry that is, well, all about the tragedy of a hero who fails to rise to the truth. Now, truth is here something divine. So, understood in terms of the hero's ascent to the divine, philosophy is the pursuit of, well, heroes, clearly, the pursuit of finite beings who seek infinity, who seek to reach the heavens, and they fail, as they must. All attempts to attain to this divine wisdom must fail. Socrates addresses this problem, and the traditional designation of people who who seek truth, and in fact even who contemplate truth in the heavens, is that of natural philosophers or sophists, ever since Plato. Of course, the term sophist was ready at hand prior to Plato, and it means essentially wise men. So the wise. And the wise were wise insofar as they saw truth beyond popular opinions, conventions, or at the very least, they sought it and they had visions of what is beyond. So they exposed themselves to what is beyond. Now, Socrates sees that as a failed attempt. Cicero tells us that with Socrates, the ideas are sought at the heart of political things, of human things. So at the heart, therefore, of conventions. And of course, Socrates is notorious for having exposed first of all, questioned the wisdom of the people of convention, and exposed people's ignorance about what they were saying. People don't really know what they're saying. This doesn't mean that for Socrates, what we say doesn't mean anything. It just means that we don't know what we're talking about, and that we therefore should not speak merely in the element of reflexes, so mechanically, but in the element of reflection. And if we don't live the rational life, if we don't speak rationally and thus speak in the element of reflection, we simply speak out of compulsion, and so blindly, mechanically. And that's utterly inadequate. That it would be an inadequate response of man to truth. So it is important to heed the sense of what we're saying, and thus the ground of common sense. Now, Plato, Socrates, they and the whole tradition that stems from it, insofar as it is faithful to its sources, are deeply, radically concerned with the content of common sense. There is something sacred, something mysterious about what we imagine in ordinary terms. There is something divine about the source, the ground, we could say the essence even, of the opinions that we ordinarily cherish. Now, Socrates is seeing the pre-Socratic, what we would call the pre-Socratic heroic ascent to truth, as a failure. He's not the first one to recognize this. I mean, all the tragic poets, the tragedians, recognize this, and that's why we have tragedies with heroes who notoriously fail in their majestic, Herculean attempt to attain the heavens. And we have Latin authors also who speak of the fool who seeks to attain the sky. Right. So, is philosophy folly, therefore? Simply folly. And, well, if we understand, however, Socrates as philosopher, then we come to a novel understanding of the enterprise. Socratism is not foolish. It is not foolish insofar as it does not seek to reach the divine. First of all, Socratism exposes the problem of the divine as a problem, and so the real issue now is the unity of the divine, or the nature of divinity, natura deorum, as Cicero would dub it. So it is not enough to look up to the gods as they are ready-made by the city. We seek the true nature and thus the unity of the divine. So Platonism is fundamentally concerned with the unity and thus the meaning of the divine. Now, for man to attain to the divine is simply impossible. Finite being reaching out to infinite being, that's simply foolish. Now, recognition of the foolishness of the attempt, however, does not, by itself, implicate the need to abandon philosophy. In fact, it calls philosophy into question. It calls, more precisely, the philosophical inclination, in fact, really the genuine human inclination, human desire, natural desire for the divine. If we cannot reach the divine, then perhaps our life is to be understood in the light of another possibility, of the possibility, and here this possibility is, of course, actualized or presented or revealed in the Middle Ages, the possibility that God attains to or reaches out to, finds the human even prior to the human seeking the divine. So now the Middle Ages will tell you, well, there's no need to seek the divine because the divine has already found you before you even bothered seeking the divine. Now this is extraordinary. Now Socratism is open, the Socratic life, Socrates himself, most notably as presented by Plato, is open to that possibility. And of course the Middle Ages understood this quite well. the pagans, the good pagans, not Epicurus, the Epicureans, not the materialists or others, but Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and the likes of them were open to the possibility of revelation. So what this means is that what their life was all about was fundamentally, essentially, radically compatible with a God that finds man prior to man seeking out God. Right. So what does man then do as philosopher, if there is such a thing as philosophy at this point, given the recognition that God has found man prior to man seeking God? Well, at this point, we're faced with a recognition that we may be told that God has found us, right? In the beginning. But we do not recognize this in our ordinary lives. For one thing, the Bible tells us we are in a fallen condition. Right. If we're in a fallen condition, we don't recognize divine providence in our ordinary lives. What can be done to recognize providence in our ordinary life? Is it enough to listen to the good news, the Gospels? Is it enough to, hear the message revealed to us, and so hear the words? Or must we not interpret those words? To be more precise, to flesh out the sense of this problem, does the philosopher become, at this point, just as anybody else, is the watershed between the classical ancient one, between the hero and the man who is not a hero at all? Is this dividing line effaced, eradicated, canceled? Everybody's the same. There's no hero, and there's no need for heroism, because we have this revelation of a God who has found us. Or is Socratism still standing in the light of revelation? Still standing, and therefore not foolish, even independently of that revelation. Now, this is something to consider carefully if we are to understand the importance of the Socratic alternative, and really the nature of heroism. If heroism is not merely foolishness, then what can it be? And the challenge that the Bible offers us highlights this problem and calls us to recognize a heroism that is at once natural to man and compatible with divine revelation. So, not foolish. All right. So what sort of heroism would we be talking about? What would heroism entail at this point? What would philosophy entail if it is not this ascent to the divine, to divine wisdom, or in fact, which is the same thing, knowledge of nature? Because knowledge of nature would mean knowledge returned to the principles of nature, to see the roots of nature. If you know the roots of nature, the source of nature, then you know the mind of God. So natural philosophy in its original sense is really the quest, the pursuit of the mind of God. Now, can you reach that? Well, for a man to do so, the only way for a man to do this so ultimately would be for there to be quantifiable distance, right, between the finite and the infinite. And that is patently foolish to establish a measure that breaches the gap between the finite and the infinite, or the determined being, finite being, and infinite being. So, okay, what about a philosophy that is not foolish? Well, philosophy that is not foolish would seem to be, and the Bible's message, the Gospel's message would reinforce this, would encourage us to recognize this, which seem to be the pursuit of a life that, and so a finitude that is open to, entirely open, exposed to infinity. We don't know, as Socratics, if God has found us. But since we don't know, we remain open to the possibility of God finding us. If we're open to that possibility, then we must make this tremendous effort to expose ourselves to the presence of the divine. The divine must be present already in our daily lives, in the present moment. And what this means is that we must turn all of our certainties, including the certainties of the self, myself here being determined, being finite being, into a question mark. All of our exclamation marks are turned into a question mark. And this is the Socratic life in this case. So Socratism is not foolish insofar as that way of life is a way of questioning, not merely and pedantically what people say, but all of our certainties, first and foremost, the self-certainty, right? The sense of the certainty of myself as an ego, as a me, right? And even the certainty of the gods being there, being given out there. So questioning our certainties would leave us with exposure to divine agency. Divine agency that would be speaking to us, that would be reaching out to us and illuminating us, and thus making us participants in that agency, and thus free to the extent that we partake in divine being or agency, actus purus, as the Latins would sometimes say, the medievals. So a pure act of intellection, an act that involves the coincidence, the unity of intelligence and being. So we say, for example, that when God sees something, he creates it in the act of seeing it. So seeing is an intellective vision, right? Act. Well, this exposure that we have to the presence of the divine as an agency in our lives, a creative agency. Exposure requires an effort, for we are filled, clogged, cluttered with certainties that we grasp, that we hang on to out of fear, out of compulsion. Philosophy now can be even exposed as this effort to give up, to let go of compulsions. Philosophy has a path to freedom, a path that involves a letting go. This is no longer foolish. It does not presuppose the necessity and clearly the public revelation of the divine that has reached man in arche, in the beginning. And yet, it presupposes ignorance that is compatible with that revelation. So, philosophy is, in Socratism now, philosophy that is not foolish is open to the possibility of divine revelation, of a biblical kind. So what does the Bible teach? Fundamentally, that God finds man prior to man's seeking out God. And therefore, the search for God, man's search for God, is impious. There is a lack of piety, of gratitude in my setting out to seek God. It is not only rationally foolish, it is also very bad, because it presupposes lack of care for the very possibility that God has found us prior to our seeking Him. Now that's Socratism. However, in our times, we have renounced, by and large, right? Our times in general have renounced the possibility of Socratism. Not only the possibility of biblical revelation. When our institutions, our schools, our governments seek answers, they do not seek them by referring to prophets and Socratic philosophers. They seek them by appealing to technicians. Agents of realpolitik, right? Geopoliticians, experts in geopolitics. Machiavellians, ideologues, think tanks, as they call them today. So, mechanical answers are sought. Because the nature of things is understood in mechanical terms, we assume that there is no God. We assume there is no God, and yet we do not leave things at ancient natural philosophy, which had not assumed that there was a God that had already found us prior to our seeking Him. The ancient foolishness has now become something else. This mostly because, we could say, we have consciously rejected what was revealed. What was revealed? The presence of the divine as an active agency in our ordinary lives. What this presence means is that there is no technical answer that is autonomous, independent of divine agency or intelligence. There is no such thing as even the slightest material force devoid of divine being. Now, this does not automatically mean that, or it would not mean, the presence of the divine everywhere would not mean that everything is determined by the divine. For indeed, we could say that we live in an obscure world, a fallen world, and there is alienation from the divine. But to the extent that there is something, that something is, then it partakes in being, and being means here primarily the perfection, the infinite perfection of being, which is what we call God. So everything is indebted to God, right? Now, modern man, and so modern man as such, so all of modern institutions at this point, today this has become extremely evident, is founded on the rejection of divine revelation. Now, what this means is that we do not seek God. We assume that if there were a God, that God would be already here and evident to us in mechanical terms. So there is no God. God is dead. The 19th century proclamation of the death of God is not dispelled, is not nullified by contemporary beliefs and appeals to religious practices. These things are absolutely meaningless as long as the fundamental questions are not raised. The societies we live in are not run by theologians. Religion is privatized, and so one could entertain some religious belief and allow it to bear upon political choices. But again, this would be as saying, well, we're going to have a private belief that informs, private feelings that inform public choices. That's not what theology, and in fact, religion is all about in its essence. So what we have today is something beyond ancient folly, and something that does not help us understand the nature of Socratism. Now, if we could only go back to Socratism in its essence, then we could see that there's a problem with our private stance today, with our modern stance today. There is an inadequacy, something that is fundamentally untenable about our posture, our situation today, and something that begs for an alternative. Now, if we could expose ourselves to Socratism as a living alternative, we would see that it is neither the foolishness of pre-Socratics nor, should we say, the madness of those who say, well, there is no God. The God that was revealed must be denied. And in this act, we're no longer the fools who say there is no God, but because he never revealed. We are the madmen who say, well, the God who was revealed is our creation. So we are the creators of gods. We are the creators of meaning. So that we're not looking for meaning in nature. We give meaning to nature, which is to say that we become the masters of nature. And this is something very modern. Becoming the masters of nature, posturing as the masters of nature. This is madness. This is utter madness in classical terms, shall we say. Not mere folly. So here we have these fundamental alternatives. And where do we stand once we expose ourselves to these alternatives? We stand in perplexity. We are confused, perhaps, at first. But ultimately, we are called to take a stance. We could die in confusion. We could die as the ignavi of Dante's Inferno, these ghost-like entities flowing around with the currents of the zeitgeist. Or we could be more substantial in our lives. Now, to be or not to be. And to be need not be to be foolish. Nor must it mean to be mad. We can choose, one might say, not to be. In a very conventional way, we choose not to be, but in fact, we are compelled not to be. We could remain in compulsion until a voice calls us, and then this voice could draw us out of compulsion and there allow us to partake in freedom, the freedom of being, and there be at war, dissatisfied, be at war with non-being, with absence of being, with absence of goodness, with absence of mind, of thought, so mindlessness. Be at war with the forces of the dark, of evil.